Hi everyone, welcome back to Asbestos 101. I'm asbestos attorney Justinian Lane, and this is part 3 of my video series, Asbestos 101. Last time, in part 2, we talked about how asbestos products were actually manufactured and showed you some cool 100-year-old videos from inside of asbestos factories. And then we talked about the kinds of things that asbestos was used for and the products that asbestos was put inside, or the asbestos products itself. Today, in part 3, we're going to talk about the health effects of asbestos. If you search on the internet, you're going to see a lot of stuff about asbestos health risks, and I don't want to be sensationalizing anything. I want to very clearly communicate what the actual risks of asbestos are and not over-dramatize them. So I want to start with 5 undisputed facts about asbestos and human health. Now, the first fact is that there is no known safe level of exposure to asbestos. This does not mean that one exposure to asbestos could cause you to get sick. One brief exposure most likely will not. Medical science does not know exactly how many fibers or how much exposure to asbestos it takes to develop an illness. What they can agree upon is that you need a lot of exposure, typically an occupational exposure where you're working with it for hours and hours every day for a period of years. If you watched part 2 of this video, or if you watch some of our other videos, you'll see that I myself occasionally handle asbestos products for the camera. I take proper precautions, I clean up, I have a HEPA vacuum, I do my best, but I'm not worried if I breathe in a random asbestos fiber, because the truth of the matter is, there is a background level of asbestos in the air all over the world, and every breath you or I take, we're breathing in some amount of asbestos. That's just a fact of life. And that leads us to point 2. Asbestos is only dangerous if it is what they call friable, which means easily crumbled or dusty. Asbestos is harmful when it is airborne. When you breathe it in your lungs, that's how it hurts you. Touching it or handling it with proper respiratory protection, no problem, although you might get a mild dermatitis or a corn or something from it, but it's not a real health risk. Point 3, the medical community at large has no doubt whatsoever that breathing or swallowing asbestos can lead to lung cancer or mesothelioma. The medical community will admit they don't fully understand the mechanisms of exactly how it happens, but they know for sure that it does happen. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. Exposure to asbestos can lead to lung cancer or mesothelioma, but they still don't know how. Point number 4, there is a clear dose-response relationship between asbestos and health risks of asbestos. What that means is the greater the exposure, the more your risk. The higher your dose, the more likely you are to have a response. Typically, the kinds of clients that I represent and who developed asbestos-related illnesses worked with asbestos for years, or someone in their household did and they brought it home and they were breathing it for years. Again, the occasional brief exposure, it's not good for you, but it's probably not going to lead to any health risks. So if you're sitting here watching this thinking, gosh, the school I went to had asbestos in it and I changed the brakes on my 58 Chevy that had asbestos in them, you're probably okay. No guarantees, but there's nothing out there that would say this brief exposure is enough to cause an illness, just like cigarette smoking. If you smoke one cigarette, you're probably not going to get lung cancer. You could, but I wouldn't worry about it. And that's what the tone that I want to get across to this is, if you were exposed to asbestos, you need not really worry if it was a brief exposure. You only need to be concerned about your health if you worked with it or had really big durations of exposure to asbestos. And that takes us to the last point, which is that it can take up to 50 years, sometimes even longer, before an asbestos-related illness will develop. So if you're in your 60s or 70s now, if you're developing an asbestos-related illness, it could be because of asbestos exposure you had in your teens or 20s or later. And that's kind of why the asbestos industry was able to hide all of the dangers of their product for so long, is because of that latency period. You don't breathe asbestos on Monday and come down with an illness on Friday. It takes years. So now let's move on and talk about the illnesses that asbestos can cause. And again, I want to be really fair and honest and direct about the risks of asbestos. So I'm going to tell you about the asbestos-related illnesses that everybody agrees asbestos can cause, and the ones that people are still curious about, that there's still some debate. Nobody will deny that exposure to asbestos can cause asbestosis or pleural plaques, which are non-malignant diseases. That means they're not cancerous. They can sometimes be fatal and they can be serious, but they're not cancer. And then as far as cancers go, you won't find any doctor out there that would tell you that exposure to asbestos cannot cause mesothelioma or lung cancer. It absolutely can. No medical doubt whatsoever. So where is there some medical doubt left? There's still some medical debate over whether exposure to asbestos can cause, and I've lumped them together as throat cancer, but there's esophageal cancer, laryngeal cancer, and pharyngeal cancer. And you'll see about the debate in that, and also over stomach cancer or colon cancer. Now, I've represented a lot of clients who have these cancers, and I'm able to get compensation for them because compensation is available. However, some doctors believe that the link between asbestos exposure and these illnesses isn't that strong. I disagree, but I'm not the doctor, and I want to talk to you about what medical science currently says about these illnesses. Before we get to that, though, let's talk about how asbestos actually injures people. The first thing to understand is a bodily process called phagocytosis. Now, if you took any kind of a biology class, you may have heard of this. And basically, what happens is that there are blood cells that go out into the body and they try to absorb foreign threats to the body, like viruses or bacteria. And those are called phagocytes, and they will try to go and envelop the harmful particle and digest it and spit it out back into the bloodstream, whatever's left of it. What happens with asbestos is this phagocytosis process is stopped. They call that frustrated phagocytosis because of the unique nature of asbestos fibers. And we can take a look at that on this slide of an electron microscope view of an amosite asbestos and a chrysotolite asbestos fiber. Now you see the phagocytes are in green, and they are trying to digest and process these asbestos fibers, but they're unable to. So the phagocytes walls are pierced by these strong fibers, and that destroys the phagocytes. And that's what leads somehow to the health issues asbestos can cause. I say somehow because medical science is still studying exactly the mechanisms. They've got this much figured out, though. And then we can show you another problem that asbestos fibers can cause, and that is with cellular division. Asbestos fibers interfere with cellular division in the similar manner, which is that they are too sharp and too long for the white blood cells to properly deal with them. So that can divide the white blood cell and cause a cell that has more than one nuclei, and that's harmful to the cell's survival. And cancer often starts with cells that have multiple nuclei. This is one of the things that happens with asbestos fibers. Your body cannot properly process them, so they get stuck in some piece of tissue, and then white blood cells come and try to attack them, and they're never able to. It's like a splinter gets embedded in the wall of your lung, and all these little balloons are trying to swallow the splinter and destroy it, but the splinter pops the balloon. That's a super simple explanation, probably good enough for this video. So how are they able to do this? It's because the asbestos fibers are so microscopic. Now, humans don't do a great job at really understanding super huge numbers and super small numbers. So we'll try to put it into a perspective to see if this can make some sense to really understand how small asbestos fibers are. When they were first studying asbestos scientifically in the 30s and 40s, they didn't have electron microscopes, and they thought that asbestos fibers were 1 to 4 micrometers in length. You could fit 25,000 asbestos fibers in the span of 1 inch if that's how small they were. Now, if you take hairs off your head and you put them out on an inch ruler, you're going to be able to side by side get about 600 hairs. How small is asbestos? In that same inch, you'll get over 1 billion asbestos fibers in 1 inch. So that is how small these fibers are, and why phagocytosis is unable to process some of these fibers, because they are penetrating the cell wall and you're getting billions of these fibers inside your body. That's where these issues come from. They're so small. So another way to describe how small this is, you've got the 1 inch of asbestos fibers can contain 1 billion of them. If you had a square inch of asbestos fibers and you laid them down end to end, you wouldn't be able to see it because they're so thin, but it would stretch to the moon and back. 1 square inch. If you take a ruler and you draw out 1 inch in every direction, so you have a square 1 inch on all sides, fill that square up with asbestos, it could stretch to the moon and back, but you'd never be able to see it. That's how small they are, and that's where all the problems come from. So this is another slide to illustrate phagocytosis and what happens with respect to asbestos fibers. You'll see this white chrysotile fiber that is trying to be dissolved by the macrophage that's trying to digest it, and it's unable to do so. And in fact, this killed that particular macrophage. And the killing of these macrophages is what leads to some of the asbestos issues, including asbestosis, as we'll hear about, and potentially some cancers. So, what happens to these asbestos fibers when they can't be dissolved through phagocytosis? Well, these are asbestos fibers on this slide you see in front of you. They're stained blue for visibility, and they're stuck in human tissue, and they will stay in human tissue forever. They don't dissolve, they don't go away, they stay there, embedded in your lung or any other portion of your anatomy where you had them go through. So those are some of the reasons why asbestos is harmful. It stays in the body, and the white blood cells and the macrophages are not able to properly process it. And that can lead to all kinds of health problems, including cancer. So let's talk about asbestos and cancer. To be very clear, all types of asbestos are carcinogenic. And I want this to be clear because there are some people who work in the asbestos industry for years that tried to say chrysotile asbestos, which, as you learn in part one, is the most commonly used type. They tried to say that chrysotile asbestos is somehow different and it won't make you sick. That's absolutely false, and you don't have to take my word on it. Instead, you can look at this standard medical textbook, Asbestos Risk Assessment, Epidemiology, and Health Effects by Dodson and Hammer, who are giants of the medical industry as relation to asbestos. And they write, there is no doubt that asbestos, for example, amphibole asbestos such as crucidolite and amosite, and Canadian chrysotile, can cause lung cancer, most often in combination with cigarette smoke. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified asbestos as a group 1 carcinogen, meaning it causes cancer in human. And they, by name, call out Canadian chrysotile because Canada, for so many years, had such an industry with selling their chrysotile that they really were resistant to accepting the fact that it was hurting and killing people. It does. Here's what the World Health Organization and IARC has to say. All commercial forms of asbestos fibers are associated with an increased risk of mesothelioma and lung cancer. And they recognize that there are some controversies about, geez, is chrysotile more likely or less likely to cause cancer than the other types? Science doesn't know that, and they're still researching it. But as they say at the bottom, all forms and sizes of commercial asbestos fibers are carcinogenic to humans. If you meet somebody who tells you that any particular type of asbestos can't cause cancer, don't listen to them. They're wrong. And quite frankly, they're probably getting paid by the asbestos industry to tell you that. Now let's look a little bit at the human respiratory system as we talk about the health risks asbestos can cause and what it does. This diagram here shows how people breathe in through their nose and down through their throat into their lungs. And we have a diagram of the lungs, and over on the left, it kind of zooms in on the alveoli where a lot of the gas exchange processes happen and breathing happens. This is where asbestos attacks. We'll zoom in a little further on those so you can kind of see in each one of those that looks like a little cluster. That's where asbestos fibers get lodged in and they start causing your health issues. One of the first health issues that was discovered to be related to asbestos was asbestosis and pleural plaques. We'll talk about pleural plaques first because they were actually seen first when they were doing autopsies on individuals who died of unknown causes. Now, pleural plaques, as described in this textbook by Uri, Sporn, and Rogley, I've always just called this Rogley's book. Victor Rogley is a doctor who's been involved in asbestos for a number of years. So in this book, pleural plaques are described as dense, firm, gray, white, fibrous tissue. And that's exactly what it looks like. If you look at an autopsy of an individual who had pleural plaques on their lungs, you'll see these gray, white sheets over the lung issue. And it says that microscopically, plaques are predominantly collagenous or collagenous, however you prefer, with scant cellularity. They're basically collagen. They're scar tissue and the things that collagen makes up. Rogley explains that the clinical implications are twofold. First, the implications of plaques with regard to functional disability. That means breathing. Your functional disability in this context means you are not able to breathe properly. And that can be measured with pulmonary function test, which is a common breath test. And number two, the prognostic implications with regard to other asbestos-related diseases. Prognostic in this case means, can we foretell that someone's going to develop another asbestos-related illness? And as it says, it has been found that pleural plaques are a predictor of increased risk for some asbestos-related disorders. Most, but not all, of the clients I've represented with mesothelioma did in fact have pleural plaques, and quite a few of the lung cancer clients I've represented have as well. Not always, but enough that in my very limited clinical experience, I agree that plaques do seem to be a predictor of increased risk. But don't take my word for it. Take the authors of this textbook, because this is what they do day in and day out. So that's pleural plaques, and we'll talk now about asbestosis. From the Dodson and Hammer book again, it says that the simplest definition of asbestosis is pulmonary fibrosis caused by the accumulation of airborne asbestos in the lungs. Now, let's talk more about this with the diagram of the respiratory system. And it can explain that the asbestos fibers that bypass the upper airway defenses are initially deposited in the region of the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts. These fibers go in, and if your upper airway defenses, like hair in your nose and other sorts of things that are designed to prevent you from breathing bad things, if those fail, the fibers are going to go and get jammed inside your alveoli and other areas in that region. And that's followed by a rapid accumulation of pulmonary macrophages, which try to phagocytose the shorter asbestos fibers and attempt to phagocytose the longer ones as well. So back to this picture that we saw. This was a case where a pulmonary macrophage was not able to phagocytose the chrysotile fiber, and the biological reactions that follow that frustrated phagocytosis are what leads to the development of asbestosis. Asbestosis is a disease that is progressive, which means when you get it, it's going to continue to get worse, and it affects your breathing. Now, the first case of asbestosis that was recognized was back in the early 1900s by a famous British doctor named Dr. Montague Murray. And he met with a committee at his hospital at Charing Cross in London, and he was doing a Q&A session with them because this was something new and novel. Now, this article was published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine by Morris Greenberg, and he writes this up a lot about what happened, and it's a good read if you want to look for it on the internet. But here's the important part. Dr. Murray was asked, have you any doubt in your mind that asbestos dust causes fibrosis? And he replies, I think there's no doubt it did in this one case. This is the early 1900s. He's not willing to go out and say asbestos exposure will always cause it, but he's got no doubt it did in this one case. So then they ask him, can you tell the committee the particulars of the case? Well, the patient was a man, 33 years of age. He'd been at work some 14 years. They started pretty young there. Then the first 10 of which he was in the carding room. And if you remember from part 2 of the video, we showed you film footage of what an actual carding room looked like, and it's very dusty. He said that this was the riskiest part of the work, and he volunteered that out of 10 individuals who worked in that carding room, he was the only survivor. Now, he eventually did pass away from asbestos-related illnesses, so I guess he didn't survive. But let's look at what a carding room looks like. This is showing all of the raw asbestos fibers coming out of these machines. You can see the dust in the air. If you can see the dust in the air, it's an incredibly dangerous level, and you do not want to be breathing it. And that's what these people did day in and day out. And as you see from the photo, no respiratory protection whatsoever. And you'll see a couple of the people in the frame are women, which was not terribly uncommon. This video was taken in an American factory where they used men and women both. And over in England, women were used even more extensively at the time. And that leads to the first known asbestosis fatality, which is the case of Nellie Kershaw. She was 33 years old when she passed away, and she started working when she was only 13. That's what young girls did. They had to go to work, and the asbestos jobs were mostly like weaving and textile type jobs, sewing jobs, which at that time were stereotypically given to women. And in the book, it says that Nellie Kershaw's case was the sentinel case accounting for the naming of asbestosis as a distinct pneumoconiosis and for giving the first discussion on asbestos bodies. Now, asbestos bodies are growths in the lungs that are caused by asbestos fibers embedding themselves in the lung. Pneumoconiosis, that's a big, hard to spell word. What it means is dust disease. There's several types of common dust diseases. If you breathe silica dust, you'll get silicosis. If you breathe asbestos dust, you'll get asbestosis. If you breathe coal dust, you'll get black lung, as they call it. All three are types of dust diseases, pneumoconiosis. So here's a picture of Nellie Kershaw. And again, she died when she was only 33 years old. And you can see towards the end that she had typical symptoms were cough and shortness of breath. That's what dyspnea means. Expectoration. So when she's coughing, she has a lot of phlegm. And believe it or not, it's pretty common that in persons with severe asbestosis, when you take the phlegm, they can put that under the microscope and actually see the asbestos fibers. She's coughing up the fibers in her lung. It's not pleasant. And she finally passed away on March 14th of 1924. Her official cause of death on the death certificate here was the primary cause, fibrosis of the lungs due to inhalation of mineral particles. Now, there's another sad postscript to Nellie Kershaw's tale, which is that the last 10 years of her life were spent battling with her employer, which was a company called Turner and Newall, trying to get some compensation for her injuries because she wasn't able to work or provide for herself or her family. It's not very uncommon, and for the asbestos companies to have fought this sort of thing. And Turner and Newall, as you'll learn in part 4, is one of the companies that helped cover up the risks of asbestos. So Nellie Kershaw's death was the first measured death by asbestosis, and her death at least caused medical science to recognize asbestosis as a distinct pneumoconiosis that was caused by exposure to asbestos. Asbestosis in Nellie's case was fatal. These days, asbestosis is rarely fatal, but I have personally represented a few people whose cause of death was asbestosis. And it's not something to be taken lightly. And when you hear people talk about asbestos not being dangerous, every disease associated with asbestos can be fatal and has been proven to be so. The next disease strongly associated, chronologically anyway, right after asbestosis, would be lung cancer. So we'll go back to the pathology of asbestos-associated diseases, and this is what it has to say about asbestos and lung cancer. Carcinomas of the lung cancer, has conventionally been categorized into 4 histologic patterns, and that's called squamous cell, small cell, adenocarcinoma, and large cell carcinoma. If you look at them under the microscope, they're all differentiated. You can tell which type that you have. And as is confirmed in the book, each and every one of those types has been shown to cause lung cancer in asbestos workers. So if an individual is exposed to asbestos and develops any kind of lung cancer, asbestos could have played a role. Well, when did science figure this out? It was the 20s when they figured out asbestosis was a disease that could be fatal. When did they find out lung cancer could come from asbestosis, or from asbestos exposure, rather? When did they discover that? And they discovered that lung cancer could come from asbestos exposure the first time in 1935. A relatively famous report by Lynch and Smith had a squamous cell carcinoma in a patient who also had asbestosis. In 1943, another person named Hamburger reported 3 additional cases of bronchogenic lung cancer associated with asbestosis, and that brought the world total by 1943 to 19 cases. By 1947, a relatively famous doctor in England named E.R.A. Meriwether was the chief inspector of factories for England and Wales. And as part of his job, which was part medical and part kind of like an OSHA inspector, if you would, he had to go around the factories in England and make sure things were okay and it was healthy and the processes were working. And he had discovered by 47 that among 235 people who died of asbestosis, 13% of them had cancer of the lung or the pleura. So that started giving people some ideas. Geez, maybe asbestos and cancer go together. The link was fully confirmed in 1955 when Sir Richard Dahl published his classic study, as the book says, that was the first systematic combined epidemiological and pathologic study of lung cancer among asbestos workers. Now, epidemiological means he was observing a large number of asbestos workers, and the pathologic study means he was studying the actual tissues of the ones who had deceased. So he was looking at a large group of people, and then when people were dying, he was looking at their cells, and he determined that carcinoma of the lung was a specific industrial hazard of asbestos workers. That paper was published in 1955 in the British Journal of Industrial Medicine, as you'll see, and it was a very prestigious and still is a very prestigious medical journal. And he observed 113 men who'd all worked for at least 20 years in places in an asbestos factory, a Turner and Newall asbestos factory, where they were liable to be exposed to asbestos, and they were followed up. And what they was basically looking to do is they have mortality tables, and they know if you look at 100 people of a certain age, you should get this many people who died of this and this many of that, etc. And what he found was 39 deaths occurred in the group, but only 15 and a half, roughly, were expected. The excess deaths were due entirely to deaths from lung cancer. 11 of those workers died of lung cancer, when according to the standard predictions, only 0.8 will round up to 1. They had 11 deaths, and they should have only seen 1. They had other respiratory deaths and cardiovascular diseases. They had 22, and they only expected will round up to 8. So you should only see 1 person die of lung cancer, and you see 11. And you should only see 8 people die of these other respiratory causes, and you see 22. He said that all of the cases of lung cancer were confirmed histologically, and all were associated with the presence of asbestosis. So of these 130 some odd workers, you had 11 of them die of lung cancer, and all of them also had asbestosis. So what did he conclude from this? He concluded that from the data, lung cancer is a specific industrial hazard of certain asbestos workers, and that the average risk among men employed for 20 or more years has been in the order of 10 times that experienced by the general population. In other words, he said, if you work with asbestos for 20 years, you're 10 times more likely to get lung cancer than somebody who does not. That sort of a number wakes people up. It woke people up in the medical industry, and it woke people up in the asbestos industry. And with respect to the asbestos industry, as you'll see in part 4, it didn't wake them up to do good things. But let's talk a little more about his study now. He said from the data, it can be concluded, as we talked about, that you've got a 10 times greater risk. But the part in bold and white, the risk has begun progressively less as the duration of employment under the old dusty conditions has decreased. This is what he actually published. But there's more to the story than that. He originally wanted to write, insufficient data are available to determine whether the excess cancer risk has yet been eliminated by the improved conditions which now exist. What are those improved conditions? What does he mean? He means that the asbestos industry, more specifically Turner and Newall, who allowed him access to the factory, had made a lot of progress, in their opinion, by the 1950s versus when these people started working, which would have been the 1930s. Improved conditions means less dust. They put a lot more dust collectors and ventilation and stuff to try to lower the dust. So what Dahl wanted to originally write was insufficient data is available to determine if the cancer risk has now been eliminated because of the improved dust conditions. But that phrase, insufficient data, that worried Turner and Newall. In fact, Turner and Newall was so worried that there was a second author of this paper, who is their medical director, John Knox. But his name wasn't allowed to be attached to this because they didn't want anybody to know it was their factory. Dahl and Knox had a modification, which was the risk has become progressively less as the duration of employment under the old dusty conditions has decreased. It's unlikely that the risk is now large, but insufficient data are available to determine whether the risk has been completely eliminated. Even this was not enough, because it still said insufficient data, and that insufficient data phrase would lead other researchers to say, well, we need more data, let's get it. The asbestos industry did not want more data because they knew that it would show asbestos can cause lung cancer. So what we got was the risk has become progressively less as the duration of employment under the old dusty conditions has decreased. They eliminated that insufficient data phrase. And there was a researcher named Barry Castleman who's written a paper about this, and we talk a little about that in part 4, that Richard Dahl mentioned a quid pro quo with Turner and Newall. And no one ever knew what that meant. The theory was that the quid pro quo meant that Dahl would get continued access to the workers at the Turner and Newall plant. Who knows? Dahl wouldn't explain, and we'll talk about that more in part 4. But Richard Dahl's study in 1955, as groundbreaking as it was, showing that lung cancer was known to be a consequence of asbestos workers, that came in 1955. This knowledge could have come much sooner. And as proof of that, I want to show you this letter. Now, Johns Manville had engaged the Saranac Laboratory to study the health risks of asbestos. They had hundreds of mice and other animals, and they put them in dust chambers where these animals would breathe asbestos for 8 or more hours every day of their life. And then after a certain number of months, they'd be killed, autopsied, and they'd look to see what they found. This is what was written to Johns Manville in 1943. Dear Mr. Vandiver Brown, who was the general counsel and at one point also the corporate secretary for Johns Manville. So he's their top lawyer, and at one point he's a company secretary, which is a special executive position. Dear Mr. Brown, the question of cancer susceptibility now seems more significant than I had previously imagined. Of 11 mice inhaling long fiber asbestos for 15 to 24 months, 8 developed malignant tumors in their lungs, and 6 of them had tumors in other organs. The incidence rate of 81% is excessive. Yes, that is excessive. And that's why when the report was put out by Saranac Laboratory at Johns Manville's insistence, everything related to cancer and that 81% rate was taken out. And I submit that if that had not been done, we Americans would have known that asbestos could cause lung cancer in the mid 1940s. And that's not just speculation on my part, because Nazi Germany by the mid 1940s had figured that out. And for all the evil, terrible, horrible things the Nazis did, they had their own war on cancer. And they figured out that asbestos could cause lung cancer, and workers who developed lung cancer were eligible for compensation from Nazi Germany if they worked with asbestos. That's why I say that if Johns Manville had not done what it did, and other companies too, America might have figured out during World War II as well that asbestos could cause lung cancer, but that knowledge was delayed for years. And you can learn a lot more about that in part 4. But let's switch gears now and talk about asbestos exposure and smoking and how that relates to lung cancer. I have represented a number of clients over the years who had lung cancer and were surprised that they were eligible for any compensation because they smoked. And they thought, well, smoking causes lung cancer. That's probably what did it. And it's easy to think that if you don't understand the very unique relationship between asbestos exposure and cigarette smoking. So let's see what Dodson and Hammer's book has to say about that. Cigarette smoke and asbestos are thought to be complex carcinogens that can affect multiple steps in the multi-stage process of carcinogenesis. Carcinogenesis is the process of cancer starting and spreading. So cigarette smoke and asbestos are both thought to be complex carcinogens, things that can cause cancer, and they both can affect multiple steps in the carcinogenesis process. And then it says, and that they interact synergistically for the induction of lung cancer or the creation of lung cancer. Now, synergy these days is kind of a corporate buzzword, but the original meaning was that something was greater than the sum of its parts. And in this case, what that means, as written here, the composite effect among insulation workers and derived from studies approximates a multiplicative model. Multiplicative meaning you take your risk of getting lung cancer from smoking and you take your risk of lung cancer from being exposed to asbestos. You don't add them, you multiply them. And that's been accepted by many authorities, it says, for the last 30 years. The multiplicative model is exemplified by the following passage of text from a chapter from Gong and Christiani on lung cancer and a textbook on occupational lung diseases. What do they quote? Here's what they said. Both smoking and asbestos are highly relevant to the risk of developing lung cancer, but in an interactive or multiplicative fashion. For the average individual in this population, smoking increased the risk of lung cancer about tenfold, and asbestos increases it about fivefold. The two together increase the risk about 50-fold. So, put another way, you are 50 times more likely to get cancer if you smoke and are exposed to asbestos than if you do neither. You're 10 times more likely to get lung cancer from smoking and 5 times more likely to get it from asbestos, but 50 times more likely if you have both exposures. And it's not just Dodson and Hammer in a book published in the 21st century that had this to say. We can go back to the mid-80s, and this was a report put out by the U.S. Surgeon General on the health effects of smoking and the consequence of lung disease in the workplace. Now, I won't read this whole slide to you, but again, it says that more than 20 years after onset of exposure, heavily exposed insulation workers had a 5-fold increased risk of lung cancer among non-smoking workers compared with non-smokers. And it explains that the risk is more than 50-fold of developing lung cancer if the workers also smoke. This risk in cigarette smoking is greater than the sum of the risk of independent exposures and is approximated by multiplying the risks. In other words, for those workers who both smoke and are exposed to asbestos, the risk of developing and dying from lung cancer is 5,000% greater than the risk for individuals who neither smoke nor are exposed to asbestos. So it's a multiplicative risk, and the risk continues with your smoking history. In this part, if you were exposed to asbestos and you smoke, please pay attention to this. The risk of getting lung cancer increases with every cigarette that you smoke. And the Surgeon General wrote, the risk is 87 times greater for workers who smoke more than one pack per day. The more you smoke, the more likely you are to get lung cancer. You know that. But the multiplicative effect of asbestos is what you may not have known. And every cigarette you smoke, even if you have stopped being exposed to asbestos, puts you at a much higher risk. So if there's one thing that people take from this video, it's that if you're a smoker and you are exposed to asbestos, really please consider quitting, because that's what puts you at such higher risk for lung cancer. And again, I want to state, I have never been unable to get compensation for a client who has lung cancer because of their smoking history. The fact that smoking multiplies the risk of asbestos by so much is why they're eligible, because the asbestos companies never said, hey, not only are you likely to get lung cancer if you're on asbestos, but you're way more likely to if you smoke. They knew that, but they didn't tell you. And in fact, some of the asbestos companies teamed up with the same law firms that were representing the tobacco companies to hide those risks. And we'll talk more about that again in part 4. Now, cigarette smoking, no doubt that it's associated with lung cancer. What about mesothelioma? We'll talk about what mesothelioma is here in just a second, but to be absolutely crystal clear, not one doctor will ever disagree with me. Smoking does not increase your risk of mesothelioma. They are separate, totally different diseases from lung cancer. So what is mesothelioma? Well, in this book, The Pathology of Asbestos-Associated Diseases, and it says that mesothelioma is literally a tumor of the mesothelium, and it's often used synonymously with malignant mesothelioma. Malignant mesothelioma, diffuse, in this context, as you see on the slide, means spread throughout. So a mesothelioma spread throughout the mesothelium. It's a malignant neoplasm arising from the serosal linings of the pleural, pericardial, or peritoneal cavities. That's where mesothelioma can strike, the pleural, pericardial, or peritoneal cavities. Well, what are those? Well, let's look at this and we'll show you. The visceral pleura and the parietal pleura are surrounding the lining of your lung and chest wall. The lining of your heart is the pericardium, and the lining of your abdomen is the peritoneum. And this next chart is going to show you how mesothelioma typically strikes. 89% of cases of mesothelioma are in the pleura, 10% in the peritoneum, and only 1% in the pericardium. There's only about 3,000 cases a year of mesothelioma diagnosed in the US, and only about 1% of those are pericardial mesothelioma cases. And that's why medical science still knows so very little about it, because they've had so few cases to learn with. So regardless of which type of mesothelioma we're talking about, we can look to this book to confirm that any remaining doubt about the association between asbestos exposure and mesothelioma was completely gone after Wagner's 1960 study. Again, we said there's only about 3,000 cases a year in the US, and they studied 33 cases, this time in South Africa, and 32 of those cases had exposure to asbestos. That's a crazy high number, and that's why they were able to pinpoint mesothelioma has a lot to do with asbestos exposure. This was confirmed by the mid-60s by a doctor named Selikoff, Dr. Irving Selikoff, who became very famous for the work that he did with mesothelioma among union workers, especially in plants, including, if you remember the advertisement that I showed in video number 2 from UNARCO, Union Asbestos and Rubber, Dr. Selikoff worked with a lot of workers from UNARCO's plants. But by this point, 1960 is what we're talking about, and this is when medical science noticed asbestos could cause mesothelioma. The Asbestos Risk Assessment book by Dodson and Hammer has this to say, and this tracks with my experience with the individuals who I've represented who've had mesothelioma. The majority of patients diagnosed with pleural mesothelioma present in the exact same manner. The most common presentation is shortness of breath or dyspnea on exertion, which is almost always caused by a pleural effusion on the side where the tumor is identified. That has been exactly how my experiences have tracked. We've had clients who they went to their doctor because they're having shortness of breath and pain on the side, a pleural effusion, which is an excess amount of fluid, is discovered, and then they find a tumor, and that's mesothelioma. It's a very terrible disease, and it's always fatal. The book continues that the greater the exposure to asbestos and the greater the inhalation of asbestos in the lungs, the greater the risk of an individual developing mesothelioma. Again, we track back to that concept of dose response. The more you breathe, the more likely you are to have a response. But this part's interesting. Most persons exposed to asbestos will not develop an asbestos-related disease, perhaps with the exception of asbestosis and the occupation of insulators. It says more than half of people who work with asbestos are probably never going to get anything, except asbestosis, which means that maybe more than half of people who worked as insulators will get asbestosis. Insulators are at the highest risk of developing an asbestos-related disease, be it asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma, or other lung cancers. So I absolutely urge, if anybody out there is an insulator who worked with asbestos for a long time and they're not sure if their health conditions could be caused by the asbestos exposure, absolutely it could if you're having pulmonary or respiratory issues. And the book continues that the published information indicates that it takes significantly less asbestos exposure to cause mesothelioma than it does to cause lung cancer or asbestosis. They don't know why. Science does not understand why mesothelioma doesn't require as much asbestos exposure as lung cancer. We don't know. This is still an ongoing, changing area of medical science. So now we've talked about lung cancer and mesothelioma as cancers associated with asbestos exposure. And at the beginning, I said I wanted to make sure everything is going to be fair and accurate, and I wanted to recognize that there is some debate in the scientific community over whether certain types of cancers can be caused by asbestos exposure. So let's look at those individual types. We'll start with the group that I've referred to as throat cancer, which again can be laryngeal, pharyngeal, or esophageal cancer. This book, Asbestos Selected Cancers, is published by the Institute of Medicine of National Academies, and it was a group of physicians that were convened and researchers that were convened to put together studies to determine whether or not certain types of cancer can be caused by asbestos exposure. They took a look at pharyngeal cancer and they decided that the evidence is suggestive but not sufficient to infer a causal relationship between asbestos exposure and pharyngeal cancer. This particular group of conservative doctors and researchers does not believe that there is absolute proof that asbestos exposure can cause pharyngeal cancer. However, I have been successful, as have many other attorneys, of getting compensation for people who had developed pharyngeal cancer after exposure to asbestos, because while these group of doctors don't believe it can cause it, other doctors do, and there is evidence that there is a causal relationship. So let's move to laryngeal cancer now. We had a different outcome with the researchers involved in this publication of this book. They concluded that the evidence is sufficient to infer a causal relationship between asbestos exposure and laryngeal cancer. They feel they don't have enough evidence for pharyngeal, but they do feel that they have enough evidence to say that laryngeal cancer is caused by asbestos exposure. And I've had no issues getting compensation for my clients who developed that particular type of cancer. Now, we look to what the authors of the Dodson and Hammer text had to say. Specifically, one of the authors of a specific chapter is Gary Friedman, who's a relatively well-known asbestos researcher in his own right. And he concludes that the only way you can base a diagnosis of laryngeal cancer upon asbestos exposure is if that person also had enough asbestos exposure to cause asbestosis. This particular author feels that unless a person has asbestosis, their laryngeal cancer was caused by something else. That's a common issue that some doctors have with certain types of cancer, and there's an ongoing debate over, can a person who has cancer but doesn't have asbestosis, is that cancer caused by asbestos exposure? I can sometimes get compensation for people who do not have asbestosis but have a different type of cancer. And in this particular case, that's what Dr. Friedman is looking for, is a person who is exposed to enough asbestos that they also got asbestosis. So that's the area, the throat cancers is where you really see some of the disagreements between reputable doctors. I have great respect for the authors of all of these books, and they have slightly different opinions than I do, but I get paid to get money for people who have asbestos-related cancers, so I admit I'm a little biased. That aside, let's look again at this book, at the Selected Cancer book. What do they have to say about esophageal cancer? They conclude that the evidence is inadequate to infer the presence or absence of a causal relationship between asbestos exposure and esophageal cancer. Inadequate to infer the presence or absence. So they're not saying it does, and they're not saying it doesn't. You can read more in this book if you want to know what their reasoning is. But the takeaway to understand is that people with esophageal cancer who were exposed to asbestos often still are eligible for compensation, even if some doctors disagree. That's kind of how our system works. There doesn't have to be universal agreement. So how about moving on to other types of cancers like stomach cancer? Here we have the conclusion that the evidence is suggestive, but not sufficient to infer a causal relationship. That's for stomach cancer, and they have the same issue for colorectal cancer. Suggestive but not sufficient. I think I've been pretty clear about it, but I want to end this video with the following note. Asbestos compensation is often available for individuals who have any of these types of cancers, regardless of their smoking history. Now, when my grandparents passed away from asbestos-related cancers, they thought that because they were smokers, that their lung cancer would not have had anything to do with anything else other than cigarette smoke, and my family was never able to get any compensation for their deaths. If I had known then what I know now, I know that my grandfather, who spent a great deal of time aboard ships that were insulated with amosite asbestos, and my grandmother, who washed his clothes and worked in industrial ovens insulated with asbestos, would have been eligible for compensation. So this video helps anybody find compensation for family members that were exposed to asbestos and developed cancers. I'll feel like I've done my job properly, even if you don't choose to hire me to get that compensation, because quite frankly, I don't like the fact that so many asbestos companies got away with paying so few people for the injuries they caused. So that's all I have for part 3 of this video about the health effects of asbestos. And coming up next will be part 4, which will be a deep dive into the cover-up. How did the asbestos industry get away with covering these issues up for so long? And we're going to show you what different companies said and what they did and who they worked with and what they knew and when they knew it. And when you're done watching that video, you'll know, just as I do, that the asbestos industry knew in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s everything they needed to know to decide these products are unreasonably dangerous and probably shouldn't be sold. But if they are going to be sold, they should be sold with a warning. And we'll talk about the importance of warnings in part 5, the last video segment. We're going to talk about compensation. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next video.